Hey everyone, all eyes on the Fed. What a crazy week, but that's not what we're here for. We're here for actually our amazing guest. Let's work in reverse order and do an introduction. So Howard, where are you calling in from? What are we talking about today?
I'm calling in from London, England, and talking about the newly published book, Launchpad Republic, which I wrote with co-author John Landry. Came out last month, and excited to talk with you about it, and thanks for having me.
Woohoo, we are super excited. Hey Byron, what are you doing? What are you up to? Where are we calling in from again?
I'm calling in from Austin, Texas, and I too have a new book out. It's called Stories, Dice, and Rocks That Think: How Humans Learn to See the Future.
That was very cool. So we'll get deeper with each of our guests in a bit, but back to you, Elle.
All right. 3, 2, 1.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us on DisrupTV. My name is Vala Afshar. I'm the Chief Digital Evangelist at Salesforce and your co-host for the next hour. We welcome you to follow us on Twitter at DisrupTV Show. Send your questions to Ray, myself, our distinguished guests using hashtag DisrupTV, and we'll do our best to answer them live. It's my pleasure to introduce my co-host, Ray Wang. He's the CEO, founder of Constellation Research. He's the best-selling author of Everybody Wants to Rule the World: Surviving and Thriving in the World of Digital Giants. Ray's a regular television business technology news contributor. You can see him every week on Fox Business, Yahoo Finance, Bloomberg, CNBC, and Wall Street Journal. In my opinion, he's one of the top futurists to follow on Twitter at RWANG0. Welcome, Ray Wang, to DisrupTV.
Hey, thanks a lot. I'm here with Vala Afshar, the Chief Digital Evangelist for Salesforce. He's also the author of The Pursuit of Social Business Excellence. Executives around the world pay attention to every one of his inspirational and insightful tweets. And when he's not hosting, keynoting, or heading events at Salesforce like Dreamforce next week, you can find him speaking on business TV outlets as well, such as Bloomberg, and posting insightful analyses on ZDNet. But as we say to our guests every week and to our amazing audience, it's not about us. It's about who we have next. And who do we have to kick it off, Vala?
One of our favorite guests is back, so buckle up, take your popcorn out. This is going to be amazing. Byron Reese, CEO of JJKent and author of his 4th book, just came out, Stories, Dice, and Rocks That Think. Brian is an Austin-based entrepreneur with a quarter century of experience building and running technology companies. He's recognized authority on AI. He's had the most in-depth conversations with the foremost authorities in the space of AI and holds a number of technology patents. In addition, he's a futurist with a strong conviction that technology will help bring about a new golden age of humanity. Byron gives talks around the world about how technology is changing work, education, and culture. He's author of 4 books, as I mentioned: Infinite Progress, Wasted, The Fourth Age, and his most recent, Stories, Dice, and Rocks That Think, which was described by New York Times as entertaining and engaging. Bloomberg Business credits Byron with having quietly pioneered a new breed of media company. His work has been featured in every major news outlet you can imagine: New York Times, Washington Post, Entrepreneur Magazine, USA Today, NPR, and more. He's an excellent follow on Twitter at Byron Reese, obviously an early adopter. You got his name, BYRONREESE. Welcome back, Byron, to DisrupTV.
Thank you so much for having me here. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, sir.
We are so excited to have you here. We're going to kick off by asking you, like, what in the heck is this book about? Does it get back to the human mind? Like, what is this? Where are you going with this thing? I read this title and I was like, what the heck? We're going deep on something, but I'm not sure what. And then I read the book and I was like, wow. So give the audience some idea of what we're talking about.
I wrote the book to answer a simple question, which is, how is it that people are different than animals? Because we like to say, well, we're just another animal, but when you look around the world, it sure doesn't look like that, does it? I mean, like, we live lives very different than any other animal. I mean, we almost look like aliens. And I really wanted to understand that. I wanted to understand what was so different about us.
Yeah, and it's amazing, right? When we think about where that goes. I mean, you look at this from multiple angles, and those multiple angles, like, actually, I mean, you start by asking questions about, like, why are we different? So, yeah, how are we different? Like, what separates us from every other animal or a plant?
You know, the cool way to start that off is to talk actually about a creature called Homo erectus, who lived for 1.6 million years. They 80,000 generations. And erectus had this one tool called an Acheulean hand axe. It looked like a big arrowhead. That's the one tool, and it never changed over 80,000 generations of them using it. And the reason that's significant is it really should have changed. Even if every erectus just was copying their parents, it would have just drifted. But what happens is we find these things on 3 continents, and they're all just alike. If I were to show you 2 were made 1 million years apart and said which is older, you'd have to guess. And you're like, well, what does that mean? What it suggests to me is that erectus was not making a piece of technology. In fact, erectus didn't even know what it was doing. It was making a genetic object, the way that beavers will build the same dam, or birds will build a certain nest, the same nest that their parents and grandparents. They don't learn it, like it's coded in them. And so you think about that. They went 80,000 generations without anybody looking at that thing and saying, you know, it'd be a little better if. They didn't do any of that. And then there's us. And somehow we got from Kitty Hawk to the moon in 3 generations. And when you look at those things side by side, you say, aha, something, we're not like erectus. We're something very different. And that sort of was my launching off point. And that took me to cave art, which I'm just fascinated by, because, when I think about these caves like at Chauvet and these you would say, and they're beautiful. They're just beautiful caves with these beautiful artwork. And then you say, well, and that's like the oldest stuff we have. And then you say, well, wait a minute. Weren't there like stick figures first? And then later they put up, like a triangle on one of them for a dress. And eventually it became beautiful cave art, but that's not what happened. We had nothing, and then nothing. And then it explodes with Chauvet and these other caves in Southeast Asia and Australia, kind of all at the same time. That's a big mystery. But the cool thing to think about is you had none of that. And then you had this beautiful stuff. And it wasn't just that it was beautiful, but there was technology there, because they had to build scaffolding to reach the high places. They were mixing the paint with animal fat, so it stuck better. They were mixing it with talc to extend it. And then when they needed black, they could have just used charcoal, right? It's all over the place, but that wasn't black enough. They used a mineral that they had to heat to 1600 degrees to get it to turn black. And the closest source of it's 140 miles from the Chauvet cave. And then when you excavate these caves, you find musical instruments. Our very first ones at the exact same moment that we get that art. And then you find representative art that, a statue of something. And then you say, okay, well, wait a minute. Something's going on here. We're not erectus with this one arrowhead. We're something. Something happened to us. And I'm almost to what it was. And I don't think I'm alone in this part. It goes by a lot of names, but something happened to us, like a radioactive spider kind of biting us. I mean, something big and dramatic happened, and we got language. And the cool thing about language is not that we use it to communicate. That came a lot later. What the real purpose of language is, it's the stuff that thought is made out of. And we think in language. And that's not just speculation. There's a wonderful passage in the book from Helen Keller, who talks about what her mental life was like before her teacher came. And she said she didn't even realize she was a thing that was different than the universe. She didn't realize she had a self. She didn't really have any concept of time or anything like that. And then with the language, and she can think. And then she said, and in that moment, I became conscious. And I think that's what happened to us. I think one day the spider bit us, happened to one person, one time, 70,000 years ago. And that gave them such an advantage that they quickly just took over the world.
Can you talk to us? You referenced technology a couple of times, but can you talk? So it's a two-part question. One is, how do you go from engaging with the foremost experts in AI? How do you go from talking about machine learning and computer visioning and neural networks and chatbots and natural language processing and all the different divisions within this umbrella we call AI to wanting to write about why humans are different than animals? What does that process look like? And then why are we as human beings, our lives are full of technologies. None of us are more than probably 2-3 feet from this device 24 hours a day, at least Ray and I. I'm not sure about you. You live a more balanced life. So as compared to, let's say, a dolphin, who we all believe to be very smart, but they're not around technology. So how did you go from AI domain expertise to writing this book? Like, what clicked? And then why are we so close to technology as compared to other living animals?
Wonderful. What people ask me what futurists are, and futurists, I think, are people who try to figure out why the future happens the way it does. Why does this happen and not that? And the only place you can get any insight on that is in the past, because that's the only place you can answer the question, well, how did we get here today? And so I think futurists naturally spend a whole lot of time in the past trying to figure out how we got to where we were.
But you tend to go way past.
Yeah.
It's not like the last, AI was in a 1956-57 conference the first time I think the word was mentioned. So I can understand studying 70 years. You're going, it's amazing how deep you go to find
the critical thinking behind this is amazing.
Let's do it this way. So for some number of billions of years, life on this planet only had one place to write anything down. Only one place to write anything down, and that's our DNA. And it's pretty reliable, but it takes a long time to add something to that. And then that minute that we got speech, well, what that did is that expanded our genome. It wasn't just what was in our cells, but it's then what's in our head. And that becomes part of our genome. And I just find that to be a fascinating notion, because all of a sudden I could say, hey, Vala, don't eat the purple berries, they'll make you sick. And that's it. You know it. And that mutation can spread instantly. And that is what our genome became. And that's what kind of we became. But what happened is, even though we have all this mental power, our bodies only run on about 100 watts of power. That's all we have. That's it. And we wouldn't have lasted very long, except we learned this trick called technology, where we could amplify what it is that we're able to do. And that's why instead of 100 watts of power, just yourself, you're probably consuming 10,000 watts of power in this moment. And that's why we're surrounded by it, because that's what takes our mental abilities and kind of amplifies them. But I actually think it tells us a different story, which is there was a guy named Leonard Reed a long time ago who wrote like 50s, I think, who wrote an essay called I, Pencil. And he said, nobody knows how to make a pencil. There's not a person on the earth that can make a pencil. And that nobody knows how to mine the ore and make it into steel and crimp it onto the ferrule and all that stuff. And yet pencils get made. And that's because so nobody knows how to make one. Then you say, well, who's making the pencils? And that's the superorganism I call Agora. That's this creature that emerges from our collective effort. And that thing knows how to make pencils. That thing knows how to make smartphones. There's not a person in the world who can make a smartphone. Smartphone requires 60 elements. Your body only requires 30. And then you say, well, why do they get made? And it's because, we learned how to we specialized, of course, to an extreme degree. We only each know how to do one little thing. And then we became greater than the sum of our parts. And I find all of that fascinating. How did we get here? Why don't dolphins have the internet or telegraphs or mail? Why don't they even have mail? Beavers make these dams and they don't know what they're doing. Like if you put a recording of running water in a field and a beaver walks by, it's going to build a dam around it. Like that's what it does. It doesn't know. And here we are. We have all this agency. And so
okay, you need to. I'd like. Please explain Agora. And is Agora ultimately responsible for the spider bite we need to get to general AI? And when will that happen?
So, Agora is a Greek word that comes. It's like the old marketplace in ancient Greece. And it wasn't just a marketplace. The government was there and the doctors were there. And I mean, it was noisy and hot. And that was just it. That was the action. That was like, and
center of the universe.
Right. And so when I was trying to think of something that evoked what happened with people, I liked it. I liked it a lot. So I guess you have to start with the idea of a superorganism. So all of your cells are alive, right? Like they each live. If I pull you apart a cell at a time and I drop those things in petri dishes, they could live. But when I was done pulling them apart a cell at a time, you wouldn't be there anymore. And it's like, well, what petri dish are you in? Well, you're not in any petri dish. You just vanished. And then I have to say, well, were you ever even there? And what were you? And so you're what is known as a superorganism. A lot of other organisms come together, and through their interaction and communication, they form a new creature that has different capabilities. So none of your cells has a sense of humor, but you do. And where did that come from? So I think all the way back to Paleolithic time. So imagine you're 5 people and you go to take down a mammoth. And you all run over there to try to take down the mammoth. And the mammoth is just annoyed by you, and it just gores a couple of you and stomps on a couple, and it's all over. Now imagine we have speech. Now we have speech. And we get together and we say, okay, here's the plan. I want you to climb this tree, and then you two go at the mammoth with spears, and I'm going to be in the front doing this, and okay, let's go. And then you're kind of yelling at each other. Oh no, he's moving. Now, what is the mammoth fighting at that point? The mammoth is fighting a very strange creature. It has 10 arms, 10 legs, but only one mind. And that's a frightening thing. That's why the mammoth is like, what? And so that's where Agora was born. To the extent you say, okay, I see how they have one mind, and that mind emerged, and that mammoth killing machine relies on these parts. Okay. And so that's the beginning of that superorganism. But now I think it's everybody. It's everybody.
Byron, I think that awakening is really powerful, right? The way you set the stage on the awakening. But I think something even more interesting that I would say that you kind of understated in your brilliant mind is what Lawrence Reed was really talking about, right? It's really about when we actually have an experience where, I don't know, socialists, interventionists, collectivists, statists, and we have people that believe that they can rearrange society for a common good, they basically crush that innovation, and they crush where humanity goes. And that's the beauty of what you're talking about in Agora. Is that what you meant? Right?
Well, absolutely. That's a really interesting thing. You think about bees and a beehive. So a beehive is a superorganism. For instance, bees can't regulate their body temperature. They're cold-blooded creatures. The hive regulates its temperature. It holds it at 97 degrees. So it's a different creature than the bees themselves. And our cities are the equivalent of that hive for us. And our cities encode all this information. Like every time we make a desire path or we knock out a wall, like we start encoding all this information. And you're entirely right. If you went in and said, I shall design the perfect city, and no one can change anything, that city would not have been built symbiotically with its usage. It would not have come together as like this one creature. It would not have come together. I'll tell you, really, the genesis of this book is really funny because I was a Boy Scout. And when you go to Boy Scout camp, you sign up for these merit badge classes, right? And they're all about woodcraft and things like that. But I was a nerd. And one time
we're all nerds.
I know. One time I went
You're
to
a super nerd. And I say that with affection.
No, one time I went to Boy Scout camp though, and I saw they had a new merit badge that they offered. It was bookkeeping. And I was like, I will take that. And so I show up, and there's 6 other Boy Scouts. We had only 7 Boy Scouts who thought it would be great to spend summer learning accounting. And we get there, and we are told it was a typo, that we had actually all signed up for beekeeping.
What?
Oh.
It's a true story.
That's a big typo.
It was. And so I fell in love with it. And when I came home, I ordered an empty beehive from the Sears catalog.
Oh my God.
And guess where I got my bees? In the Sears catalog. I ordered 20,000 bees, and they come in this box. And you got it there. And so I grew up watching these bees. And I would hear all this lore about how when, according to beekeepers, if the beekeeper dies, somebody's got to go out there and tell the bees the beekeeper's dead, because otherwise they're just going to be like, I don't know what's going on, and they're going to be. And that's the notion of the superorganism. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if the hive takes on consciousness or self-awareness or anything, but it becomes its own creature. It becomes a thing that's different than the parts, just like you're different than your parts.
But before we get to probability theory, I want to talk about, you said the greatest invention in history was paper? Why paper? We had speech. You explained speech and how we got together.
You got to put it somewhere.
Well, here's the thing.
Mobile.
Here's the thing.
I mean, what made it so significant? Because your other inventions are pretty huge, like that you stack on there. So.
Okay, so you're with me that like when we got speech and could write thoughts to our brain, that became another, like our DNA, a place we can store information, right?
Yeah.
And that's huge. But that pales to what happened when we started writing things down. Now, everything that's written down, that is Agora's genome. That is our society's genome. Now, just like your genome, a bunch of it, most of it's junk DNA. Most of what's written down is junk. But our DNA,
like those books we're writing, Vala.
Is Byron reading my tweets?
I think he was reading my draft notes for my book.
That is us now. That we're one creature. We're one planetary wide creature that with one set of knowledge, and we behave as like one organism. And if there's one uncontacted tribe out there, they're not part of it. But the minute you meet them and you tell them about Santa Claus or anything, then they're looped in. They're part of that mind. There's nothing mystical about what I'm describing. I mean, any more than it's mystical about how you emerge from your cells. Like, pretty amazing. But I'm not. This isn't some kind of a new agey kind of thing. It's me really trying to understand how simple parts like cells or people can come together and accomplish these. Really,
you're saying paper expedited our you're saying paper expedited our dissemination of information, just like as you get into the next set of ages, right?
That is exactly right. We no longer had to have what we knew tattooed across our chest. Right.
Ray mentioned probability theory, so that's my main question. But do you consider Sir Tim Berners-Lee and the inventor of the web as someone who contributed to one of the greatest inventions ever?
Absolutely. That's part of this, us coming together to form this organism, Agora.
So in the book, you break down the history of intelligent species into 3 acts. We talked about the first act, which was ancient humans undergo an awakening, developing their cognitive ability to mentally time travel using language. So language was Act 1. Act 2, in the 17th century, France, the mathematical framework known as probability theory is born, a science for seeking into the future that we use to build the modern world. Talk to us about this probability theory as the key to the second act.
So when we got language and we got the knowledge of the future and the past, we could imagine the future. And that's what our stories were. the story started as probably as us imagining 30, 45 seconds into the future. I could do that. I could do this. But we're an ambitious lot. And so very quickly we said, it's great to be able to imagine the future, but we want to predict it. We want to predict it. And to predict the future, you have to know why it happens the way it does. And this was this huge mental block. It's hard to believe that before 1654, we didn't have math and we didn't have data. And the whole idea of probability was conceptually beyond us. But then we learned something. I have a prop. I'll be quick with it. So when you say, why does the future happen? There were all these different theories, like it happens because it's destined to happen, or fate, or what have you. But nobody ever said it happens because of randomness. So maybe you've seen one of these. It's called a Galton board in the Science Museum. I'm about to flip it, and all these BBs are going to start falling. And when they fall, they're going to hit a piece of plastic, and they can, with equal preference, go to the left or the right.
Is that a Gaussian distribution?
That's exactly what it is. And every time you get that. Now,
who's a nerd now?
He's still a super nerd.
So I can do that all day long. It's always going to be the same. And
that's amazing.
And how is that possible? That is randomness. I'm looking at right there, and yet there's order and predictability in randomness, and that was the mental thing we figured out that allowed us to create probability as a science.
Wow. So this is like the prequel to singularity that we're talking about here, right? Ooh. I mean, so we get all this stuff. Hey. Singularity, here's the future, and no one explains how it happens. And now comes Byron, right? I mean, this is basically the prequel.
Like, do you debate with AI experts in terms of, again, I'll go back to the question: when do you believe we're going to get to, or are we going to get to general AI?
I don't believe in general AI.
Okay.
I mean, general AI.
Breaking news here.
No, but is that because you believe we are the most amazing creatures ever created, and we can't replicate it?
Even at zettabyte computing scale, even at the amount of incredible ingestion of data that's going into these models.
To be clear, I hosted a podcast and I asked 100 different people that question.
Yes.
AI experts, and 97 of them wouldn't have agreed with me. Only 3 would have. So I understand I'm in the extreme minority, but I think all 100 would agree on this statement, which is we don't know how to make general intelligence. And our only reason to believe that we can is it's based on the notion that people are machines. And if people are in fact machines, then someday we'll build a mechanical brain or person, and then it'll get better and better and better. But if people are not machines, and you don't have to go all like spiritual to assume that there's something about people that you cannot reproduce in a fab. That isn't, to me, a crazy belief. I mean, think about it. We have these brains. We don't know how they work. We don't know how we store these thoughts, and we certainly don't know how you retrieve them. And those give rise to your mind, which is creativity and all these things. We don't know how that works. And we're conscious. I can feel temperature, and all a thermometer can do, all a computer can do is measure temperature. I can feel warmth, and we don't know how that is. And that's a really annoying problem, because not only do we not, science doesn't mind us not knowing something. What science has problems with is we don't have any idea how the same elements that make a rock make you, and somehow you're able to experience the world. How can that be? Like, what does that formula look like? And so we don't know any of that, and yet to say, oh yeah, but we're going to make general intelligence. I just don't have that much faith. Like,
Byron, you can even project warmth. Think about that digitally. This is amazing and fascinating, and I honestly believe like everyone who picks up this book is going to be completely blown out of their
minds are going to expand.
Are we a vessel that a spirit just happens to be in at the moment, or are we much more, or why are we different than someone else? And we are definitely.
And we didn't even get to Act 3. We got to get you back on the show.
Well, I'll tell you. And then this book that is 44 days away from being finished, according to this big number, it is just about Agora. And it asks the question: is Agora just a metaphor, which is fine, or is Agora a system like a car and it can break? Or is Agora a thinking, living creature?
So, Byron, this is my invite to you. Hopefully, at that point, you will not be writing another book, and you will be at CCE 2023 in person as one of our keynotes, so that you'll be there live with us. So hold that date, October 23rd. to the 27th, October 23rd, 26th, 2023. Hold that date and we will have you there. So we are here with Byron Reese, CEO of JJKent, author of Stories, Dice, and Rocks That Think. And we're going to hear more about Agora in a bit, but follow him on Twitter at Byron Reese. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
That was fun. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Agora we go.
I just want to be a fly on the wall to see his process. How did he even come up with the title like that? It just rocks that thing. I'm sure his publisher is like, Byron, you're killing us here.
Obvious and non-obvious based on what we heard last week.
Okay, speaking of extraordinary authors, people are this next segment will again expand your mind. We're going to be watching this show over the weekend, at least I am, so I can, relearn all the wisdom nuggets that are being dropped. John Landry and Howard Wolk are co-authors of Launchpad Republic, which is a new book that just came out. John Landry is a business historian, writer, and a former editor at Harvard Business Review. He's adept at taking a massive detail and distilling the story or key insights that leaders find useful. John's worked with executives, consultants, academics, and has incredible experience in a variety of countries and cultures, and we're going to learn in the next segment. Howard Wolk is an experienced entrepreneur, company builder, investor. Howard is the co-president of the Cross Country Group, a privately held firm consisting of startups and mature companies. Howard is a former senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. Welcome, John and Howard, to DisrupTV.
Thank you for having us.
We are so excited. This KSG HBR collab is amazing. No, just kidding. Inside joke. But hey, we are so excited to have you here. And, this is one of the most important topics. It's probably what makes American entrepreneurism different and why we actually have an interesting edge. And I think it's something that should be taught in every single school at every single level. But let's start with the fundamental question. How can entrepreneurship be a form of rebellion?
We again, thanks for having us. We spend a lot of time thinking about the act of entrepreneurship, and most of your viewers who are entrepreneurs will intuitively understand that being an entrepreneur is somewhat of a rebellious act. The whole David and Goliath nature of entrepreneurship is really an important part of what drives startups. And there is a very anti-authoritarian kind of take over the world aspect to entrepreneurship that's really important. And as we looked around, while the entrepreneurial community understands that, a lot of other people don't. A lot of policymakers don't. A lot of general, interested professionals don't really understand it. And it's a war. We have a chapter 2, called Gorillas and Gorillas, and it's all about the tension between startups, gorillas, who scrape and claw and find their way into a market and challenge an established interest, and gorillas, which are the big, well-resourced companies that don't pay attention until it's too late, or unless they start to be, the smart ones now are starting to pay a lot more attention. But that dynamism, we think, is at the root of what's made America so successful over 200 years, and it's something that needed to be better articulated and needs to be better appreciated, we think, as people think about entrepreneurship going forward.
John, talk to us about the ultimate rebellions in the startup world, and what does it mean to be a unicorn in terms of measuring entrepreneurial success?
Well, we start the book with Uber, which I like as sort of a classic example of the good and bad of entrepreneurship, which is there was a real problem in the marketplace. Taxi cabs were not convenient.
Oh, they sucked.
It was just a hassle in a lot of ways.
You're too nice.
And so this entrepreneur came along with a different idea about how to make it way better. But the problem is there were all these laws that basically protected taxi cabs pretty much in every city, all around the world. And but Uber was so excited at its technology that the founders basically said, let's just put it out there and see what happens. So he started off in San Francisco, and sure enough, the taxi cabs say, hey, you can't do this. It's against the law. But people loved it so much, and they hated taxi cabs so much, I guess, that they basically put all this pressure, and cities all around the country started changing the laws. And so now Uber could go everywhere. But if you are, think about it, if you are an established company, you don't want to be known as a lawbreaker. You know, it really was left to the entrepreneurs who were kind of rebellious, who said, I don't want to deal with terrible taxi cabs anymore. I don't have a lot to lose. I'm going to try this. There's kind of an emotional component, which is why we like it as a rebellion. And so entrepreneurs have to break things, in effect, and they have to be really believe in what they do. And if all you want to do is make things a little better, well, big companies are great at that. They're really good at incremental improvement. But in order to get big advances, we really need entrepreneurs.
So it's never about better sameness. It's about rewriting and reinventing and just creating new experiences that are not just incrementally better than what we're used to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So why does that make us the beacon of entrepreneurship? Like, what are we doing different? Is it because our people are less complacent? Is it because we have more immigrants? Like, I mean, what are the factors? What are the values that allow us to go break rules? I mean, every other country, let's take COVID, and I'm not going to politicize it, right? Take COVID. Everybody else was compliant. Like, oh, government says you need to do this. And everyone's like, okay. And we're like, no, we're going to fight you. We're going to do everything on our own. We were so different compared to the rest of the world. Can you imagine someone in China right now is like, oh my God, those people, they're out there. What are they doing? Those Americans, they're crazy. I mean, it's just what makes us so different.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a great example where America brought to bear both the values of big companies, which could get innovation out into the market quickly and efficiently and at scale, and the Modernas of the world, the startups, using new technologies and new platforms to come up with creative ideas that wasn't part of the established protocols for thinking about innovation. And the two were very symbiotic. They work well together, and we really leverage both.
Do they feed on each other? The fact that we know we can go do this, and the fact that we're not afraid.
Yeah, but it's also I think the political economy is really important. We talk about this a lot in the book. That in a lot of other countries, to go back to the Uber example, there's a sort of an implicit favoritism toward producers, toward established communities, toward stability. And we have this attitude, well, okay, those are nice. We certainly want to have property rights and all, but we also kind of like things that get better. And we kind of admire the entrepreneur as kind of a hero. And we really believe in the right to compete. And so throughout history, there have been these entrepreneurs who have challenged laws even. And the government has come around at the federal, usually the federal, but often the state level. And they've said, well, actually, there's not a good reason to have this kind of restriction. So the entrepreneurs should be able to compete, or they've struck down monopolies. And,
like Tesla's in Texas, for example, right?
Well, Tesla is, or think about SpaceX even. I mean, SpaceX wanted to break into a business, and the government basically said, we have this nice collection of big companies. They're giving us what we need. And so, no, you can't bid on this contract. And so SpaceX sues the government. He sues his customer and says, no, you have to work with me. You have to negotiate. You have to take our bid seriously. And our courts basically said, well, he's right. And here in America, we believe in everybody having a chance to compete. And it's not right that, the government should just, the executive branch should just go with a favored bunch of companies. And so, no, you have to take his bid seriously. And sure enough, not only did SpaceX start winning bids, but it also introduced a radical improvement in space technology. And if we had had a different government that had said, no, you can't sue your customer. What are you doing? We're going to shut you down, or how dare you? A lot of companies would have.
So John, you're saying our political, legal, and cultural frameworks allow us to do this. So we have permission somewhere.
Exactly. Now, we're not perfect. There's still some regulatory capture. There's still some companies with, I think, too much government favoritism. So I'm not saying we're this wonderful, totally open society, but compared to other countries, I think we're way ahead.
Yeah. Is Elon Musk the greatest rebel of the 21st century?
Well, I'm a historian, so it's hard for me to make comparisons, but he's up there. That's for sure. Okay.
So let's take it to Benjamin Franklin, which you referenced as the original upstart. Yeah. Can you talk to us about Ben Franklin?
The
OG. Well, Ben Franklin is a fascinating story that we could talk about a lot, but I think it really shows how America differed, because when Ben Franklin was growing up under the British Empire, he started having some success and he thought, oh, I want to be one of the elites like everybody else. And so he kind of transformed himself as this, he said, forget my working class origins. I'm actually a landed gentry, or I'm going to look like one. And he commissioned this fancy portrait of himself, and he tried to curry favor with the imperial authorities. And then along comes the revolution, and he switches sides, and he says, no, I really want to. He started supporting the rebels, and he started supporting the government, and he did all these really good things that helped us. I mean, he really is a founding father. Once he understood where America was going, and so he transformed himself back into this kind of upstart, guy who was challenging the authorities. But there was a time in his career when he really wanted to be an authority. So that revolution really helped us differentiate ourselves from England and a lot of European countries that kind of favored established authorities.
I would add that he made his fortune as creating a media empire, kind of the DisrupTV of 1760s Philadelphia.
After 900 interviews, Ray, we're called DisrupTV.
Trying to match every one of Franklin's inventions, but yeah. Okay. Thank you, though.
It's a first that I'm being compared to Ben Franklin. This is amazing. Go on, please, Howard. Keep going.
One thing I'd add is when we were doing kind of recommendations at the end of the book, the first draft of recommendations are government should do this, government should do that, government should do the other thing. And then we sort of said, actually, what's amazing about the United States is that government isn't a single entity in a way that can do it all. It's balanced power, and it's much better in general at responding to initiatives that come from the people throughout the country than it is about a very concerted national industrial policy. We have some of that, and the government can do that, and it can be very effective at doing that. But it's not as it is in many other countries, where if you came up with a wish list, the government would do it. I mean, when you look at Japan and Germany and many other countries of the world, which are governed by strong powers, this is a much more reactive, messier, more entrepreneurial, more scattered, and more innovative kind of construct than anywhere else in the world, precisely because of the democratic institutions, separations of power, federalist system, the national government against the state governments, or separate from the state governments, and a very reactive kind of situation. And that's and the Uber story compared to the other ride-hailing companies kind of crystallizes it. But throughout the book, we try to show that that's what makes it's not a surprise that we're the most entrepreneurial, and we have the institutions of democracy.
So I would ask a more social question. We go from time to time believing that centralized planned economies are going to out-crush us. We saw that during the Cold War, right? We now see this with the CCP China threat, right? That's going on. And we sometimes lose faith in that, in the way that our organizations and democracy and systems are set up. We're forcing industrial policy right now with the CHIPS Act and other things like that. How do we get back to that, to understanding that at the long run and the long term, that spirit within us and the systems within us will take us there? Because we doubt ourselves every 30 years, and we're in the middle of that right now.
Well, if you look at the early 1970s or the mid 1970s, when Japan was cleaning our clock.
Oh, they were.
That everybody thought that national policy, industrial policy was going to be the only way for us to compete. And then, Reagan in particular kind of broke through a lot of that, national.
And Thatcher.
And sure enough, I think with the benefit of hindsight now, look where Japan is over the last 3 decades, and look where we've come over the last 3 decades. And I think it's been pretty clear that our more responsive, entrepreneurially driven economy really shows itself. And it's interestingly, Reagan, I don't think, was necessarily looking at startups when he tried to deregulate, but the unintended consequence was that the entrepreneurial economy over the last 3 decades has shown the difference, and these more planned economies have had challenges keeping up. I think China is exactly the same story now, and there's a lot of fear around whether authoritarian capitalism will prevail. But I do think the lessons of how we competed against Japan and why we can still compete is why we're going to still be able to compete against China over time.
Yeah. I might add, we started working on this book in the years before the pandemic, and China looked pretty good then. They looked like they were going to, be ahead in these emerging technologies, and they seemed to be so focused and disciplined, and they were pretty impressive. And we originally thought we'd have to talk a lot about China in the end of the book because they seemed so formidable. And then, now they've sort of like they started shooting themselves in the foot with, pulling back on their big companies. The government is wary about any kind of rival power centers. And they're always going to be a strong economy, but I think their ability to innovate is really going to be tough as long as the government wants to have so much control.
Yeah. Well, if I may, one of the things that we talk about in the book is the churn rate of big companies in the United States. And that churn rate is accelerating. And the average lifespan of a Fortune 500 company, I think, is 17 years or something like that, an all-time short time frame. When you look at Japan, they have the same companies that dominate the economy, that have dominated the economy for over 100 years. And in fact, many in Japan think their problem is they have too many old companies who've been around too long. And you could easily see a scenario like that in China over time, where we're in the second, third, or fourth inning of this entrepreneurial wave in China. You're going to have big companies dominate the economy, but in 30 or 40 years, they still may be the ones dominating the economy and maybe having some protectionism, or maybe not. But I think the likelihood is, in an authoritarian context, the big companies that make it today are probably going to be there for the next 30 or 40 years without some organic challenge such as we have here in the United States.
It's funny you mentioned, as I recall, 2019 in discussions in terms of the race between U.S. China. Dr. Kai-Fu Lee's book, AI Superpower, was probably the most talked about book in my circle in 2019. But the conversations are definitely different and less, and so there has definitely been a shift in how we view the competition since the pandemic. Ray's in Cupertino. My company's center of gravity is in San Francisco. So can you talk about like Silicon Valley and how revolutionizing the American entrepreneur landscape?
Sure, Howard, go ahead. Or Howard, I can do it.
Sure. I mean, I'm from the Boston area, and there are books written about how Route 128 dominated technology for a long time until the last 2 or 3 decades, where Silicon Valley and the much more fluid, open systems, faster cycle time type companies really became more innovative and more dominant. And I think that, coupled with the hippie ethos and the freedom ethos that was so important throughout the 60s and beyond, I think really has set a tone around entrepreneurship, not just in terms of business practices and speed and innovation and open networks and those kinds of things, but also a political framework around how entrepreneurship really has a rebellious spirit. And as countries around the world look to Silicon Valley, I think it's not just about the business practices, but it's quite a bit around the cultural attributes as well.
Has it taken a hit in the last 2 years? Because if you ask me where the crypto center is, I would say Miami. Where you say where the growth of innovation in the largest state, I would say Texas, and certainly Boston, New York. But is it this work from anywhere where you don't have to, spend $1.5 million for a 1-bedroom apartment? And that's probably an understatement. Like 500 square foot, one bedroom. Do you think Silicon Valley will continue to maintain its dominance in terms of venture capital and investments in startups and so on and so forth?
I think it's still going to get its share for sure, because most of the smartest people go there, want to learn from there. The venture capital's there, the ecosystem is there in large measure still. Yeah. But you raise a great point. Texas, Florida, where else? New technologies. It doesn't take a lot to develop some talent pools and a couple good companies. The venture capital will follow. Yeah. And there's no reason to think that Austin's obviously great, Miami's great. There are so many places where these new technologies and the ecosystems can build that I don't think it's going to have the same dominance to the same degree it has, because I could see several other areas, not to mention California has its set of issues too, social, political, environmental. So I think, and cost of living. So I absolutely think that there is now going to be room for other communities, if they're smart and if they foster the talent that's there, to find their niches and then build on those niches to make bigger ecosystems. For sure.
Steve Case has been, pioneering that movement long before the pandemic, as an example. Entrepreneur.
I think what's important about Silicon Valley really comes out my background is business and economic history. And one of the problems with the field is that there's a tendency to play down entrepreneurship, I think, and to play up sort of the assembling of resources. So if you read some economic histories, they think, Silicon Valley, that it really mattered that there was an existing electronics industry with big companies, and that you had a lot of government money in the defense industry. And so Silicon Valley was almost like going to happen. And the entrepreneurial part is sort of taken for granted. And to emphasize Howard's point, it's not just that you have resources, but you have people who are willing to work creatively, to be rebellious. Silicon Valley didn't happen from big companies. It happened from startups and garages more, and from venture capitalists who were willing to work with these little startups and take some risks. And that can happen anywhere. It doesn't have to happen in the Bay Area, outside of San Francisco. It can happen in all these other cities you're talking about. And so in a lot of countries, they try to mimic, reproduce Silicon Valley by having these resources and even venture capital. But if you don't have rebellious entrepreneurs, you're not going to get there.
Related to this, the question that really sits in the back of my mind is, how much does our immigration play a role? Because, for example, we look at Japan, 3 generations out, it's stale now. Germany worked because the Turks came through. You have other immigration that's there. China's stuck in immigration landmine. But the countries that have flourished in the last 100 years seem to be coming from, like the UK, Canada, the US, places that have been open to immigration Australia seem to be doing much better in terms of creating those types of frameworks. Or does immigration not play a role in that? And
immigrants are the ultimate rebels. I mean, come on. Who can debate that?
Really left, right?
Well, and there's no question. I mean, the data supports that in terms of the number of big companies that get started by immigrants is pretty astounding, and it has been that way from the beginning. Really, some of the first wealthiest Americans were actually immigrants even back then, and so it's definitely been part of our thread work. And interestingly, I was at something. I'm in London with someone from Germany who was just talking about exactly that, about the Turkish immigrants having really helped shake up a little bit of the German economy and create some of the best companies, biotech and others. And so there's no question about it that immigration is absolutely a linchpin to it. People have talked about that, but not necessarily thinking about it, how it links to our political economy. And it's not just it's a big market, but it's a good environment for immigrants to come in and challenge the established order and go to whatever heights they can go to. And that's a very unique thing around the world for sure.
Indeed.
Yeah. It's the nice thing about entrepreneurs is that they're self-selected. Like, it's not that easy to change your country. It's not that easy just to arrive. And so you have to be somebody who's a bit rebellious to begin with. And yet it's not just immigrants, because there are a bunch of other immigrant countries out there like Canada and Australia. And as you say, even Britain is allowing more immigrants. So and why haven't those countries had as much entrepreneurship as we have? And so I think it all works together. The entrepreneurs help to promote the kind of federalism that Howard was talking about, the kind of distrust of government, the decentralization and rebelliousness. And so immigrants are important, but they're not the whole picture.
Sure. My final question, Howard, John, what do you hope the reader walks away with after reading Launchpad Republic? Like, what's the ultimate? What would bring you joy if someone read your book and they told you this? What are you hoping that they walk away with?
Sure. I mean, I would hope somebody would read the book, and many people that I've talked to already have sort of felt this. I would walk away saying, I really understand entrepreneur in the context of American history and in the context of American politics far better than I did before. I read about entrepreneurship. I understand about IPOs. I understand about unicorns, but I've never really thought, gee, that's just only part of the story. It's really entrepreneurship takes place in the context of American democracy, Americans' political systems. The kinds of challenges we have are going to be solved by entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship. And entrepreneurship in America is different than it is elsewhere in the world. And many countries are trying to become more entrepreneurial, and they are becoming more entrepreneurial. But entrepreneurs and venture capital isn't enough. You need the broader systems. You need to understand how balanced government, decentralized finance, a role for the consumer, the whole cultural attributes all work together to make it a great place for entrepreneurship. So hopefully people will come away more informed, better citizens, better leaders, better entrepreneurs, and really have a much more thoughtful context. And it's not a long book, and it's a relatively easy read, I have to say, but it does have a little bit of nuance to it that hopefully readers are picking up on and will say, yeah, I think I understand entrepreneurship in American context much better than I did before I opened page one.
That's awesome. I wish I read your book a couple of weeks ago. I went and saw Hamilton, the musical, and I saw the tension between Hamilton and Jefferson, but I didn't have the entrepreneur lessons. Yeah. Had I read your book, I would have had a much more understanding of what I was witnessing. Go ahead, John.
Speaking of Hamilton, I want to second what Howard said, but also I think there's a tendency, and Hamilton represents the good and the bad of this, to think, okay, in order to have a good economy, we have to sort of figure things out. We have to mastermind them. We have to have industrial policy. We have to have everybody, all our ducks lined up in a row. It has to be nicely coordinated and controlled. And that's what China's doing, and we just need to do it in a more democratic way. And I think that's fundamentally wrong. That's flawed.
That's flawed.
There's a messiness to American business and economy that actually is really good. And a lot of young people in particular look at this messiness and say, oh, capitalism is all screwed up. We need to bring some order here. We need to bring some better distribution. We need to make it more equitable. And in fact, the messiness is the openness, allows for a lot of openness that will bring a lot of the good things we really want. It just takes a little bit of patience. And we have to we have to put aside our blinders saying, only well figured out societies and economies run by experts can have good results. No. You can have a really good result from what looks pretty messy.
Is the innovation velocity that we're accustomed to, speed and direction, cause of that messiness? So, it's just, where we produce and innovate at a rate where you should expect messiness.
I think the messiness is more a result of the decentralization that we're talking about. That on the one hand, we have these national and global markets, but we don't have one or two big companies kind of deciding everything. It's all these little companies working together. I was just your previous guest talked about nobody knows how to make a pencil or a smartphone. Well, nobody knows how to make an economy work, but somehow it does. And it's a very messy process, and there are no experts who are in charge, but it happens in this amazing way. And I think we need to think about that in terms of the role that entrepreneurs play in really moving us forward.
We are here with amazing business acumen, historical perspective, and an understanding of what makes America works. John Landry and Howard Wolk, thank you so much for being here. Authors of Launchpad Republic. It should be required reading inside all schools so we understand what is the heart and soul of what we do. Thanks a lot for being on the show.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much. Come to think of it, Ray, no one really knows how DisrupTV works.
We don't either.
Elle does, our producer Elle.
Howard and John, if they stay in the green room, we'll explain to them later.
Like you and I, we have no, we're gonna cross 1,000 guests by sometime early next year, and I have no idea how this show works.
We're like freaking frack, back on NPR.
That's awesome! Wow. Okay.
Who do we have next?
Who we have next? Okay, so next week is episode.
Oh my God! Look at this list.
Suja Chandraskaran, Senior Executive Vice President, Chief Digital and Information Officer at Common Spirit Health, a giant healthcare provider. Joanne Moretti, Chief Revenue Officer at Fictive, former CMO at Dell, and former Chief Digital Officer at Jabil, one of the largest manufacturing companies. So Joanna is extraordinary.
Oh, wow.
And Christy Hunter Arscott, an award-winning advisor, speaker, and author of a book, Begin Boldly: How Women Can Reimagine Risk, Embrace Uncertainty, and Launch Brilliant Careers. Wow.
Amazing.
Wow. What a lineup. My
And
goodness.
you still have Dreamforce coming up next week, too.
For those of you watching, because I want a little bit of sympathy, I'm flying red eye back to Boston. So I've already warned Ray. You might see some guest hosts next week, but we're going to play it by ear. I don't sleep on planes, and I'm guessing I'm going to be shattered. Yeah, Ray, we're only hosting 150,000 people in San Francisco next week. So as one of the fortunate employees of Salesforce, I am going to be it's my Super Bowl next week, so it's going to be amazing to
One of my
be
favorite
with you. I'm going to be with you. I'm going to be with some of the people that we jointly admire most, including many of the guests that have been on our show. So I can't wait to give you a big hug, my friend. Not a virtual one, but a real one. And hopefully we get to break bread as well. Okay, before we go, just 1 minute summary of today's show, Ray.
Oh, this is a lot of things that we used to teach in school and in our educational system, really the power of critical thinking and the ability to actually think about, why things happen. How do we get here? And, I think in times of fear, we forget that. We forget what makes us powerful, what makes us successful, what makes us, equitable, what makes us inclusive. And it's really our ability to have personal freedoms, our ability to think on our own, and our ability to live in an amazing society that was created by our founders. Our founders were wise individuals who thought through what had happened in the past and learned from that. And those systems that they left us gave us these abilities. Maybe we are an agora. That's a whole different story. But when we think about how this all works and adds up, I mean, we're chaos theory. We're living chaos theory at work, right? And somehow, somewhere, I mean, we exist, right? Maybe other people exist, or other individuals, or beings, or life forms exist. I mean, we exist, and we don't know why either. And I think that's the mystery that we're all trying to solve: how systems work, how we work, right? And more importantly, how we all work with each other. But I think there is an important lesson here. These are things that we no longer teach in schools, and this really worries me. And I hope we actually teach this type of critical thinking, this type of entrepreneurship, the understanding of how we got here means a lot to me. And I think these two guests did an amazing job talking about this. And I hope we can consider our ability to actually live in a culture of abundance instead of a culture of scarcity. That's something we have done an amazing job of in this country. But that's about it. If you want me to pontificate.
Wow, Ray, that was awesome. I couldn't have said it better myself. I'll just end with: immigrants are rebels, and that's a good thing. Lots of startups popping up at Martha's Vineyard right now. Just kidding. Okay, for those of you watching news, forget that. Al, delete that last comment. Okay, if it's Friday, it's DisrupTV. We'll see you next week. Thanks, everyone.
And Howard, we'll see you in the green room. Bye.
Bye.